This shed on the banks of the Tilligerry Creek in Port Stephens is a hive of activity as oysters are prepared for market. It's an unusual sight in recent times, with the local industry almost brought to a standstill more than 2 years ago due to QX disease.
Initially, that was really up around the Karura area, but in early 22, it was seen to really affect oysters widespread throughout the whole of Port Stephens.
QX stands for Queensland Unknown after being detected there in the 1960s. It wiped out the oyster industry in Sydney's Georges River in 1994, hit the Hawkesbury River in 2004 and again last summer. Researchers are still trying to determine what harbours the QX parasite and what triggers outbreaks, particularly in the popular Sydney rock oyster. It doesn't affect human health, but it does kill oysters. When it appeared in the Port Stephens estuary in 2021 and 2022, the impacts were devastating.
A quarter of our industry had ceased working, not necessarily turned their farms in, because that brings some challenges too, but had stopped actually growing oysters in a commercial way.
Before the QX outbreak in Port Stephens, the oyster industry was worth $10 million. Latest figures show that value has dropped by $3 million. Third-generation oyster farmer Matt Burgoyne was one of many whose business suffered.
Unfortunately, we saw severe mortalities right through the 3 crops of rock oysters that we had and put us in a difficult situation.
The past couple of years have tested the resilience of those still left in the local oyster industry. But as they so often do during tough times, farmers are looking at innovative ways to keep their businesses afloat.
Since then, it's been a matter of lots of changes, business model changes, species changes. It's been, one challenge after the other.
So what are these?
These are Richmond River oysters. These guys are pretty small, they're only at 8 millimetres, but they'll spend the next 2.5 years here on farm before we send them off to market.
Richmond River oysters are now being trialled on farms. They're similar to Sydney rock, but appear to be more resilient to QX. The species that's bringing in cash flow quickly is the Pacific oyster.
They have a shorter turnaround of 12 months, and we saw that really as the only way that we could start to generate income and keep the farm going.
Pacific oysters are an introduced species and come with their own risks. They're not impacted by QX, but are susceptible to the Pacific oyster mortality syndrome, another deadly oyster disease.
Yeah, so they're a bit muddy.
The species is helping Alex Watt's business survive.
They're the same, very similar sort of value, which is quite amazing, and we've been farming them now for a couple of years and they've really helped us with cash flow, and we wouldn't be here in this position if we didn't currently have them.
He's also using other estuaries, growing juveniles further south in the Shoalhaven region as well as north in the Macleay River.
They've got QX issues up there as well, but they are managing them really well. So we've put a large amount of stock up there as like a nursery and juveniles, and then they come back here, go into Port Stephens and go on harvest leases and then get sold into the market from there.
Do you feel as though just having more species to work with, more location, just gives you more option and kind of lowers your risk?
We've spread the risk. So if we ever wipe out in one, we've got other places to turn to load up with stock. So it's not for everyone, it's hard work, but it's something that we chose to do.
Science is increasingly important in the future of oyster growing, not only in Port Stephens but right across New South Wales. Senior fisheries scientist Laura Parker is part of a state government program to breed Sydney rock oysters that are more resilient to QX and grow faster.
Our recent results came in March this year, where we assessed our 2022 year class, and we found that the average survival of our spats, so those juvenile oysters following one exposure to QX, was 80%. So we're really tracking well in terms of the goal that we're aiming to achieve.
The oyster's ability to withstand multiple outbreaks has also been worked on.
So we originally had been focused on that one outbreak, but now we're hoping to be able to improve their resistance following an outbreak during the juvenile spat stage and then again during adults.
Examining the impact of climate change has recently been added to the program.
We've been doing research for a number of years now and found that particularly for the Sydney rock oyster, climate change poses a really significant threat. So these are things such as ocean warming, ocean acidification and marine heat waves.
However, farmers found oysters from the breeding program didn't cope during the QX outbreak of 2022. Andy Myers is an industry project manager.
And we know so little about QX, and it seems to behave differently in different estuaries as well. So some of the stock that's been bred for QX resistance performs really well in some estuaries and not so well in others. The program needs a bit more time to understand QX a bit better and to get the genetics right.
Oyster farmers typically catch juveniles in the wild before growing them, but the threat of disease has meant hatchery-grown stock is becoming more popular.
Because it gives you access to oysters that have particular traits that you might be looking for. So whether that's disease resistance or fast growth or climate resilience, which is where the breeding program is kind of moving towards, having those traits in your stock obviously gives you somewhat of an insurance policy against those kind of events.
Industry bodies have been training farmers to better handle and grow hatchery stock. They've also created a disaster handbook.
So I ended up interviewing 22 farmers across the state, over 16 hours worth of interviews. Their learnings and their insights have been distilled into this handbook, but there are a lot of QR codes, a lot of links straight through to the farmer's first-hand experience.
The New South Wales Government waived farmers' levy fees for 2023 and 24 after QX broke out. But many in the industry say there has been no specific QX funding in response to the disease.
Obviously there were flooding events, so there was natural disaster support payments available, but no direct financial support directly around QX.
Ben Rampano works with the State Aquatic Biosecurity program, which is helping farmers determine when the disease is likely to be most active in their estuary.
Window farming comes from the understanding of when QX is likely to cause impacts each year. Oyster farmers that have been dealing with QX in other estuaries have adopted this process where they won't deploy oysters to high-risk areas during that window of infectivity, or they'll move oysters that they have in the high-risk areas out to other locations until such time as the window passes.
But oyster farmers would like more funding for research into the disease.
QX is not a new parasite. It's been around since the 50s in some way, and it's devastated estuaries like Georges River and the Hawkesbury River before, and we still really don't understand it. And so we need to get some key learnings about QX.
Port Stephens oyster producer Justin Welsh says the region is crucial to meet a growing demand for oysters.
It has a really unique condition window where we get some of the best quality oysters from around New South Wales coming out of Port Stephens at a time of year when production is tight and a lot of other estuaries around the country have fallen out of conditions.
Lack of supply due to QX has had an impact on the market.
Not only did we see the national supply decline, but also Port Stephens plays a really important role in our ability to supply Sydney rock oysters all year round. So with the impacts to Port Stephens, we've seen supply become quite tight at critical points throughout the year.
Has that impacted the cost of oysters?
It has. So Sydney rock oysters are only really produced in Australia and in a small volume in New Zealand. So anytime we see a decline in supply, it means that there will be a price impact. Also, a lot of farmers have had to contend with the fact that they're trying to survive in challenging economic circumstances. So as costs to produce rise, so does the price of rock oysters.
Many farmers believe growing a range of species is needed going forward. Surveillance testing shows the latest QX season in Port Stephens has been much milder than the past 2 years, But given the uncertainty around the disease, oyster farmers are still cautious. Despite a tough couple of years, there is hope for the future.
I think the industry can get back on its feet in one way or another. I can't imagine that Port Stephens, being such a big oyster-producing region, could fall over to absolutely nothing. And so my hope would be that within 5 years, Port Stephens is back up and growing and producing like it used to.